Research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research on different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank, and being close to policy, commenting on policy, and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now, this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I, for many years, have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course, with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy, that it has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries, and books on foreign affairs by not only former diplomats and established academics but also by upcoming scholars. Our journal, India Quarterly, is being published since 1945. ICWA's publications are also being translated into various Indian languages. What is ICWA's role as we move into the future? The vision of the institution is to stay abreast of all the momentous changes taking place in the domain of foreign policy. New areas are emerging. There are strategic technologies, there is climate change, there is artificial intelligence, and there is cybersecurity. How can our research faculty and the audiences that come here be better informed about developments in these areas? How can we write and formulate research papers to give policy inputs that help in government policy formulation? These are the emerging challenges for ICWA and form a part of our vision for the future.
A very good afternoon to those in India and the East. Good morning to those joining from Europe and the United States. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the ICWA webinar. My name is Priyanka Pandit and I am a research fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi. Today we are going to discuss the UN at 75 and a century of Indian multilateralism. This year marks a significant dual anniversary for Indian multilateralism, arising from its membership of the League of Nations and the establishment of the United Nations with India as a founder member. India has been one of the most active members of the UN right from its inception, often playing a role beyond what may have been warranted by its economic or military capabilities. It has not only attempted to strengthen the UN system and make it more representative of contemporary global realities, but has also significantly contributed to combat challenges of development and poverty eradication, disarmament, human rights, peace building, peacekeeping, climate change, terrorism, piracy, etc. More recently, India has called for reformed multilateralism, that is more purpose-built, in tune with today's world, where growing uncertainty, protectionism, mercantilism have put multilateralism under unprecedented stress. In this backdrop, today's webinar will discuss evolution of India's multilateral approach, its approach to United Nations, its institutions and processes, and examine the roles that India can play as it prepares for its 2-year tenure in the Security Council beginning January next year. To deliberate on these broad issues, we are joined by a very special set of panelists who really don't need an introduction and carries a rich experience of serving in the government, academia, and international organizations. Ambassador Asoke Mukerji, the chair for today's discussion, served for over 37 years in the Indian Foreign Service, retiring as India's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York in December 2015. Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri is former Deputy Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations and former Indian Ambassador to Nepal, European Union, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Professor Manu Bhagavan, who has joined us from the United States, is Professor of History and Human Rights at Hunter College and Graduate Center CUNY and Senior Fellow at the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies. He is currently writing a biography of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, one of the most celebrated women of the 20th century and a pioneer of international diplomacy. Dr. Archna Negi is Associate Professor at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament of the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Aniruddha Rajput is a member of the United Nations International Law Commission and served as the chairperson of the drafting committee of the International Law Commission at its 16th session in 2017. Before we begin today's proceedings, few customary housekeeping rules. The participants can ask questions by logging to the chat box at the bottom of the page. Click on the guest option, type your name, accept the terms and conditions, and join the discussion. The chair will take questions during Q&A session. Participants are requested to keep their questions clear and brief. Without any further ado, I now turn over the screen to Ambassador Asoke Mukerji. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit, for that introduction. I would like to thank the Director General of the Indian Council for World Affairs, Ambassador Bhagavan, for having put together this event. We had discussed it some time ago, and because of the COVID pandemic, probably we were not able to do it earlier, but better late than never. You mentioned two significant anniversaries, Dr. Pandit, one being the 100th year of India's membership of the League of Nations, which began functioning in January 1920, and the 75th anniversary of India signing the United Nations Charter, which established the United Nations in June 1945 in San Francisco. To that, I must add a third anniversary, because that's important for Indian diplomacy, and that is that it was in 1920 that the first Indian diplomatic mission began to function abroad. It was created by the Government of India Act of 1919, and it was the High Commission of India in London. The first delegations to the League of Nations, in fact, were headed by the High Commissioner of India in London, and it was only from the third session of the League of Nations that others became leaders of the Indian delegation. Today's subject is very intriguing and interesting, both from the perspective of looking back at this rich history and tradition, as well as looking forward to what you called the prospect of reform multilateralism. In our discussion today, we will look at how India has contributed to the evolution of the multilateral system over the past century, but especially during the last 75 years when India has been a founder member of the United Nations. I am delighted that my dear friend and colleague Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri will lead this panel discussion. He will speak on India's role in contributing to the political pillar of the United Nations, especially the Security Council. We recall India's stellar role following her independence in August 1947 in catalyzing the process of decolonization, which resulted in giving substance to the democratic provisions of Article 18 of the UN Charter, which gives one country, one vote in the General Assembly. Under the UN Charter, the Security Council is mandated to maintain international peace and security, and yet when it comes to taking decisions on international peace and security, it does not follow that democratic principle and instead is guided by the provisions of Article 27, paragraph 3, which give the veto power to each of the 5 self-elected permanent members of the Security Council. This is a big anomaly, and I'm quite sure that your listeners today will want to talk about how we can reform the Security Council to make it more democratic, and in terms of the mandate given by world leaders at the 60th anniversary summit of the United Nations in 2005 to make it more representative, more effective, and to make sure that its decisions can be implemented on the ground. So 15 years ago, these issues were highlighted, and I look forward to Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri's remarks and suggestions on how we can address these issues. We could not have asked for a better person to have actually spoken at this discussion, because Ambassador Puri has sat in that Security Council the last time we were there in 2011 and 12. So he knows better than most of us what exactly is at issue and what is at stake and how we can move forward. The next speaker is joining us from New York, Professor Manu Bhagavan, who's professor at Hunter College, New York, and a part of the Ralph Bunche Center, as was mentioned. And one area which many in the audience look to and ask me very often is what has been India's contribution to the human rights pillar of the United Nations. Because a lot of people know about the initiative we took in 1946, a year before we became independent, on the removal of racial discrimination on the basis of color in South Africa, which eventually metamorphosed into the anti-apartheid movement and resulted in April 1994 in the first multiracial elections in South Africa and the election of President Nelson Mandela. But apart from non-discrimination, there were several other significant Indian initiatives in the early years of the United Nations on human rights. Just last year, when they celebrated the 75th anniversary of the issue of gender equality as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations on its own website paid tribute to Hansa Mehta, the Indian delegate who sat in the drafting committee in 1948 and replaced the words "all men are created equal" with the words "all human beings are created equal." So that's a contribution which I think also plays a role in when we look at India's participation in the norms and framework of international human rights issues. And of course, since you're writing a book on Vijayalakshmi Pandit, I cannot help but mention this fascinating account in the book of Raphael Lemkin, in which he talks about how he wanted to have a resolution adopted by the General Assembly to mandate the negotiation of the Genocide Convention. And he had to find 3 co-sponsors. And those days, the United Nations General Assembly was dominated by Latin American countries. So he got 2 co-sponsors from Latin America, which were Panama and Cuba. And then he had to look for one from Asia. And he went to Vijayalakshmi Pandit, and she gladly agreed to make India the 3rd co-sponsor. And that's how the resolution was adopted, and the negotiations began and concluded in December 1948 with the adoption of the Genocide Convention. So it's a very rich heritage, and Professor Manu Bhagavan is the right person because he has, in his writings, focused on bridging the divisions between East and West, between capitalist and communist, and he could speak on how this vision of one world, of a humanitarian perspective, will fit into what the United Nations created in 2006, which is the Human Rights Council. How can we make the Human Rights Council more relevant and more responsive? And also, probably, if you have time, Professor Bhagavan, the peculiar role of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who coexists with the Human Rights Council. So you have an individual not accountable to anybody, but responsible for human rights issues. And you have a group of 47 countries who are accountable through regular elections to the international community who are also dealing with human rights issues. So how do we look at the future in terms of the interplay between these 2 parts of the United Nations? Our 3rd speaker is Dr. Archna Negi from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, an acknowledged expert on multilateral environmental issues. I was very happy to know that you are participating because in September 2015, we managed to conclude a long-drawn process of converging development and environmental issues in the Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development. And of course, there are goals out of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There are many goals which are economic in nature or not purely environmental in nature. But in terms of what Prime Minister in his key address to the Economic and Social Council just last month said that without reform multilateralism, how can we make a success out of implementing this ambitious agenda for sustainable development? And I think that in this particular context, I look forward to your remarks, Dr. Negi, especially on initiatives that India has taken, such as the International Solar Alliance, the proposal of the Prime Minister on a coalition for disaster-resilient infrastructure, and of course, whether India can and should play a role in a multilateral initiative on the use of water resources, which seems to be one of the major challenges facing humanity in the near future. And our fourth speaker is Dr. Aniruddha Rajput, an eminent legal expert and a member of the International Law Commission. I have spoken a little with Dr. Rajput before our session began on this curious question which always comes up on the role between the United Nations Security Council resolutions and the international legal conventions which are debated, negotiated, and adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. The specific example that we have in mind was India's initiative in the General Assembly on comprehensive convention on international terrorism, and the fact that while there are issues on definition, there's also a very activist move by the Security Council to mold international responses to terrorism through its Security Council resolutions. So what is the interplay between Security Council resolutions and legal conventions on international terrorism? And a broader question is the relationship between Security Council resolutions as international law and the treaties which are registered with the United Nations under Article 102 of the UN Charter. Two examples come to mind, both are relevant and topical. One is the India-Pakistan question. There are several resolutions of the Security Council on the India-Pakistan question which date back to the 1948-53 period and then subsequently in 2 or 3 batches thereafter. But in 1972, there's a bilateral treaty which makes no reference to the Security Council resolutions, and yet the Shimla Agreement Treaty is registered under Article 102 of the United Nations Charter. And that article provides clearly that in any dispute that is raised in front of any UN organ, including the International Court of Justice, it is a registered treaty that will be applied. So does the Security Council resolution therefore fall by the wayside, or what happens? And more recently, the United Kingdom referred to a similar situation with regard to their bilateral treaty of 1984 between the United Kingdom and the People's Republic of China on Hong Kong. And they themselves have been harping on the importance of Article 102 of the United Nations Charter. So this is a subject which I think we will benefit a lot on from listening to an eminent legal mind as Dr. Rajput's. And I really look forward to that. With these remarks, I would like to invite the distinguished members of the panel to make their remarks. And Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, you have the floor, sir.
Sir, thank you very much. I want to thank ICWA at the outset, Ambassador Bhagavan, Dr. Pandit, and I want to thank all of you friends who are here. Some of you we've known and some we haven't. But Aniruddha, I was particularly delighted to get to know the person who's made many things that have happened in the last few years at the multilateral fora possible. So great getting to see you. Of course, my greatest delight is to have my ex-boss chairing the session here, Ambassador Mukerji. I did not know that the entire business of India in multilateralism at 100 had something to do with your family. But today we all know that it was his grandfather who treated Sir Ganga Singh, the Maharaja of Bikaner, who's the guy who started all of this for us, his daughter. So, sir, what a set of coincidences, and I'm particularly happy with it. I want to tell you, my interest in history actually goes back to his room in the Permanent Mission of India, where he had this beautiful, huge blow-up of William Orpen's famous painting on the Versailles Peace Conference, which had one person standing with a lovely pagadi and a tura, and that was Maharaja Ganga Singh. So, you know, all of us have a great sense of pride, and we begin with all of this. But let me leave you with one thought. My focus of what I will say is basically in terms of what we should do. But let me leave you with one thought. Of course, we were there in San Francisco. We were there in Havana, which is really the forgotten UN conference because it never took off. But we were also there in Bretton Woods. And not many people recall and remember that if the World Bank today deals with matters of general development and not just what it was supposed to be, the International Bank of Reconstruction, and then came the word development. This is a lot due to the actions and works of the Indian delegation, which had technically an Englishman at its head, but was really anchored by C.D. Deshmukh. And we also managed to change the quota formulation at the IMF. So, lots of things have happened, lots of very interesting things, but all of that is really the past. Today, there is no doubt that we are at a very nice confluence. The UN at 75, multilateralism as we know it today, starting with the League of Nations at 100. But I believe as far as India is concerned, there are three other very important comings together. One, of course, is in 2 years, it will be India's independence, a reason for us to try and use these opportunities to push things forward. We are serving on the Security Council 2021-2022, the year in which we will be celebrating 75 years of our independence. Let us also remember, we will host the G20 summit in India. Now that is one huge big achievement. Think about us. We were only a few years back referred to as a developing country which was struggling in various ways. And now we are sitting with the premier economies of the world, and indeed we'll be hosting them here. We'll also be hosting the BRICS summit. So in my view, these are very good auguries to try and bring together, I hope, a slight amount of change in the global mindset for a place for India. Now, India was one of the, perhaps the only, or maybe there was one other exception of a country which was not a fully sovereign, independent country, which attended the Versailles Peace. Original members by virtue of that of the League of Nations, something that was not very easy to get through the British cabinet, but they agreed. They agreed for a very simple reason. They thought they had 2 votes across the high table out there. But, life then moves on in its own various ways. By virtue of this membership, we were invited to the United Nations conferences in San Francisco, Havana, and in Bretton Woods. But we played stellar roles, and the most beautiful part is that despite our colonial masters being present, they actually let Indians lead the delegation and play and bat for India. Now, their thinking may have been that you get another member who will bat for you. But that's fine. At the end of the day, our delegations batted very strongly for development. They batted very strongly for ideals of freedom, later on decolonization, etc. So we have a very sterling and a very beautiful past. But let's also remember, we were not grandfathered in 1945. There's at least one country which did get grandfathered. Now, there are various reasons why that happened. These reasons go into the realm of history, of the kind of, trans-Pacific situations which had happened, and so on and so forth. But one country did get grandfathered. We were not it, and I'm referring to China. Look at the state of play. And so, therefore, whether we like it or not, it has been a kind of struggle, because we must remember one or two simple points. The United Nations is not a global government, but global governance. It's a system of global governance. Secondly, it isn't multilateral in its purest sense of the term, which is one country, one vote, and let's leave it at that. It isn't. It is multilateralism with multipolarity. And the multipolarity gets seen in lots of facets. In the Security Council, obviously, through the permanent members and the veto. In lots of other places, it gets shown up as contributions to the budget. Really speaking, in all these organizations, if you contribute more, you can certainly ask for more. And one of the simple expedients of going about is you place your people in key decision-making places who tilt the balance on the way the organization will tend to sway. And I repeat this once again. It is not a matter of great and good members of the Indian community in India and overseas. But since this is truly an intergovernmental set of processes, And there can be lots of world processes. This being an intergovernmental set of processes, what you really need are your people. Good people, I'm very happy. But your people need to be meritorious. They need to meet the criteria because they need to stand and bat on the global high table. So that's really something that needs to be worked on. Smaller countries really don't have those capacities or those choices and options. Larger countries, the most important ones, they do it by entitlement. Those who pay more, the Nordics are one of those great examples. They do it by simply the fact of their pay strip. But all the others need to work hard to make this possible, because at the end of the day, that's how you get your point of view getting some degree of traction on the global table. Now, I was very fortunate to be member of the Indian Permanent Mission when we last served on the Security Council in 2011-12. And let me tell you, I think most people will recall even today of extremely momentous times. That was the time of the Arab Spring. And let me again share with you, when we got elected in October 2010, we made a lot of preparations to deal with a large number of possibilities. But who would have told us to think that there could have been an Arab Spring? How many of us would have known that a fruit seller in Tunis felt insulted by a municipal worker and it unfolded in the Arab Spring the way it did? And you're still seeing it in action. Syria is still going on. So lots of these things happened. We were caught unawares, but I think we did ourselves great credit. Please note, and I'll say this with a little bit of feeling good about it. Time magazine reserves space, especially photographic space, only for the United States ambassador to the UN. But yours truly and the German PR have been featured in Time magazine. They didn't agree with what we did, but at least they had to put our photographs. Perhaps the only time when the UN Security Council may not have adopted a resolution without a veto being exercised. We had 5 countries which abstained, which meant that if 2 more had tilted the other way, they wouldn't have got 9 affirmative votes. And this too is a matter of some other debate and discussion of how it happened. But we came to within a whisker of perhaps the only time that happens. People noticed, they certainly noticed that, these are players in the game. They have something right to say and do. And if you notice, one of the most contentious things which was there in the World Summit Outcome document, the one that Ambassador Mukerji referred to, the responsibility to protect has finally gone off the table and not many people are talking about it. At that time, it was the only thing that was being talked about, and that there was a kind of beholden and inbuilt rights on the behalf of some people to be able to set right wrongs as they perceived in other people's cases. So many things happened. You mentioned counterterrorism. We chaired the counterterrorism committee. There wasn't an easy task to get onto the chairmanship of the counterterrorism committee. We had huge opposition from the P5, one of whom told me personally that, it is for us to look after things. You have a vested interest. Of course, I have a vested interest. That's why I want to chair the committee. I am not doing that for altruistic or any other reason. But this is the kind of challenges that you take up. And we introduced the concept of zero tolerance, which even today is something that is helping us. There are many other issues which, Aniruddha, I'd love to hear from you, which go on. But basically, as I mentioned, because the United Nations is really about multipolarity, working in multilateralism, it tends to give you this particular issues, that where you have the power, you exercise it. In the rest of it, you say, fine, that's perfectly okay, but we won't let it go. Elections are a very important platform at the UN, and it gives us a kind of a judgment point of where you are. Let me let you know that perhaps the only time that India and China have had an election where we have faced off each other, not that both of us were contesting and both of us could get in. We faced off. It would be either you winning or me winning. We defeated them. This will be the subject of something that I will write and many of you will come to know. What is it that I want to tell you? From even the time that we were there, about 10 years back, to now, India has grown immeasurably in the world. We are now the 5th largest economy in the world, going in the direction of becoming perhaps the 3rd largest economy in the world. We are being invited to join an extended G7 meeting. It doesn't happen just like that. We have Prime Minister Modi, whose personal visibility, reach out, has propelled India to a place where we are globally recognized as a country which can do something. Look at COVID. I know some of us are very unhappy that COVID means that the United Nations General Assembly, with all its cloak and duggery, cannot happen. But I'm very happy there's COVID. Otherwise, 1,000 people wouldn't be watching our seminar today. We would have been invited to ICWA and maybe 50 people would have been there if we were lucky at that. So many things happen. But if COVID is an inflection point, if it is a point to be leveraged, and when I look at inflection points to be able to move the horseshoe table, I can't think of anything as huge, diverse, and as massive as this. And we've done well. We've shown to the world that we are a responsible and a capable nation, which is not just large in its size, but which contributes to human well-being, a human-centric approach, which Honorable Prime Minister has mentioned in a lot of places. So I leave you all always with the thought that at the end of the day, in all such institutional arrangements like the United Nations, most important is where do you stand on the institutional framework. The permanent members are important. Why? Because they are permanent. Not only because they have a veto, but because they are permanent, they always need to be consulted. If you get into any institutional arrangements where you will be part of those who take their decision, your weight will depend on how much you bring to the table. But the fact of being there is by itself principally the most important, which is why I always pitch for the fact that when there are openings, you move to take the opening. Politics is the diplomatic song and dance of the day. It will take place. There is no doubt about that. Whether country X should be admitted to something Y or not, let me take the case of Taiwan and WHO, whether they should be admitted or not. Look, this will happen one way or the other. You should certainly play the game because there's no reason why you shouldn't play the game. But Taiwan is there as part of the WTO. So, ways forward are always there. But will you be consulted the next time around? Possibly not, because you may not be on the executive board of the WHO. How is it that you ensure that you will always be among those who at least need to tick the box, even though you may not be the only decisive player? And that requires reform, which is why I stop by saying, in my opinion, the most important thing to try and see that we bring about institutional reform which reflects contemporary reality and which gives India a leg up and a place around the high table. I think we richly deserve it. We've more than done our share, whether it's peacekeeping, whether it is today in the global pandemic of COVID. If our numbers had been more, look at what the global response and the global situation would have been. Look at our contributions in terms of being able to bring about resilience in the global economy as we built out of the recession caused by COVID. Or even if we try and bring others into a more global rules-based order. The world needs us. We are ready for it. But we need to make the necessary efforts to ensure that the institutional arrangements of the world recognize and have us there, just as the G20, perhaps the G7, and many of these are there. At the United Nations, not having had the luxury of 1945, we need to make the necessary efforts in this regard. Priyanka, thank you very much for giving me time. And Ambassador Mukerji, thank you very much for...
Thank you, Manjeev. That was very, very thought-provoking, and we'll come back to some of the issues that you raised. I would now turn the floor to Professor Manu Bhagavan. You have the floor, Professor. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukerji, and for your opening remarks. Good morning to everyone from New York, and good afternoon to everyone tuning in from India. I just learned a lot from Ambassador Puri, but the most important thing that I learned is that it's very difficult to have to follow him. Now, I'd like to begin by thanking the Indian Council of World Affairs for organizing this webinar, and Ambassador Raghavan and Dr. Priyanka Pandit for inviting my participation. It's really a pleasure to join my distinguished fellow panelists to speak on the UN at 75 and a century of Indian multilateralism. So I'm going to focus my very brief remarks on India and the conceptualization of multilateralism with a focus on human rights and the question of sovereignty in the very early part of the period in question, that is the century of multilateralism. So I think as Ambassador Puri and Ambassador Mukerji indicated in their remarks, this is my topic in a nutshell, India has advocated and advanced internationalism for a century, since it took a seat as a founding member of the League of Nations. It played a significant role in the creation of our modern institutions by identifying key injustices and inconsistencies in multilateral bodies, targeting the gap between lofty language and power politics, drawing on globally situated domestic ideas. What does this tell us about historic multilateralism, and what lessons can we take away for the future? A quick outline of what I hope to cover in just a few minutes. I want to just touch on India and internationalist ideas, and then focus a bit on India and the League of Nations and questions of sovereignties, which was at the heart of that. Then turn to India and the founding of the UN, which was in part a response to India's position in the League, the importance of human rights, and what all of this means for us today. Okay, so the origins of Indian internationalism are often linked with 1919 and the birth of the League of Nations. Nehru and Gandhi would discuss such ideas over the course of the 1930s and 40s, eventually weaving them into the country's foreign policy. Nehru had been inspired by the tumultuous events of the 19-teens, and particularly the idealism espoused by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. He's got some issues, obviously, which are coming to the fore right now, but that's aside from the point. That's Wilson. Yet 1919 was not the birth of Indian internationalism. Aside from the fact that Nehru himself drew from a range of thinkers, Rabindranath Tagore, as is widely recognized, published, for example, The Home and the World and Nationalism in 1916 and 1917, respectively, grappling with many key principles. But modern India's commitment to internationalism and multilateral organization can be traced back actually even further. Here, by way of very hurried illustration, is Sarojini Naidu writing as early as 1903. This is her. Quote, "It is because that my beloved father said, 'Be not limited even to the Indians, but let it be your pride that you are a citizen of the world, that I should love my country. I beg of you, my brothers, not to limit your love only to India, because it is better to aim at the sky. It is better that your ideals of patriotism should extend for the welfare of the world and not be limited to the prosperity of India, and so thereby to achieve prosperity for your own country.'" So India's most celebrated writers, thinkers, and political figures were thinking globally, not just for India, but of the world, from very early on. India, from that point, participated in organizations like the International Office of Public Health from about the same time. India joined the Imperial War Cabinet in 1918, and as a result attended the Paris Peace Conference and signed the Treaty of Versailles, thereby becoming a founding member of the League of Nations. India's participation was an anomaly, to use a term that Ambassador Mukerji used in his opening remarks. The only non-self-governing member. This not only made India's position unique and its navigation of issues very complex, it also singularly empowered Indians to identify fault lines and deeply embedded flaws in the existing system. India's participation initially elicited much hope, stemming in measure from Wilson's proclamations regarding self-determination. That is, this was a colonized world, and Woodrow Wilson had propounded an idea called self-determination, and so people saw India's participation in the League as possibly leading to self-determination for peoples around the world. But it quickly became clear that the League was not going to radically change things. Indeed, the institution was framed by South African Jan Smuts along liberal imperial internationalist lines. India's participation and the League's mandate system raised questions regarding sovereignty. The League was essentially a union of nation-states, yet India was not one. In relational terms to the League and to Great Britain, its sovereignty was constantly negotiated on governmental, on representational, on theoretical levels, and on others as well. Sovereignty was also an issue internally as India had many princely states, and the initial League representatives were from the Chamber of Princes, as Ambassador Mukerji knows. So some takeaways from India's experience in the League. There were some cons and there were some pros. The cons were that India had to navigate its international postures vis-a-vis Britain, and many saw India as simply an extra arm of the colonial metropole. India was not able to accomplish very much, though representatives often actually did speak freely. Also, India paid high dues to the League of Nations. However, this still had some benefits. Most clearly, India got a seat at the diplomatic high table, one of a select number of countries accorded this platform. This gave it a status benefit and created an opening for it to challenge the status quo. Through this perch, Indian leaders identified two key reasons for the League's failure. One, it was actually very weak, too weak in fact, and it failed to stop the invasion of Manchuria by Japan, of Abyssinia, that is Ethiopia, by Italy, and so on. It was essentially an imperial institution, this is the second major weakness, which led to many inconsistencies and hypocritical stances. This provides some context for the significant role that India played in the founding of the United Nations on the other side of World War II. As a quick aside, I note that it was the Indian Council of World Affairs that played a significant role in this moment as well, since the newly created organization sent a small delegation led by Vijay Lakshmi Pandit and assisted by founding member H.N. Kunzru, to the United States in late 1944 and early 1945 to discuss the future of Asia in a post-war world. There, Pandit helped articulate a much more inclusive framework for international organization. Through this trip, she also led a counter-delegation to the United Nations Conference in San Francisco. To fend off her efforts, the old Imperial Guard adopted lofty language in the charter of the new United Nations. While they believed this would shield their privilege, India later led the charge to hold them to the higher ideal. In essence, therefore, it was this initial foray at San Francisco that allowed the UN to have the space to become what we understand it to be today, and to negate some of what the original imperial powers had hoped it would be. India played an even more critical role when, the following year, they led the charge against South Africa, as Ambassador Mukerji indicated in his opening remarks. The complaint was that it had adopted a discriminatory domestic law, South Africa had, that targeted Indians. South Africa, led by Smuts, defended itself importantly on the basis of domestic jurisdiction. The United Nations had no business interfering in its affairs, they proclaimed, because Article 2.7 prohibited interference in domestic jurisdiction. The issue got to the heart of the imperial inconsistencies that had plagued the League. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit led India, standing in for the entire colonized world, to victory. This key and important victory established a key precedent that no state could hide behind domestic jurisdiction to violate something called human rights. The United Nations would debate what exactly this term meant and what it constituted for the next several years, and it would take longer for it to be formally adopted. But India played a key role in all of that as well. It was specifically these things, as well as the organizational structure of the United Nations, that set it apart from the League and that gave it such potential through the 1950s. What India accomplished was necessary to help contain international conflict and to hold states accountable to certain standards. While it can be debated how effective all of this was, given failures like Vietnam, there were also indisputable successes, including major negotiated settlements like the Korean Armistice and many smaller peacekeeping operations as well. So it is disturbing to see the erosion of the international commitment to human rights and the evisceration of the norms that were put into place to make all of us healthier, happier, and safer today. The previous UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, Zaid Hussein, for example, in a parting shot, called our current climate, quote, appalling. The problem remains the inconsistencies and imperial ambitions that India first identified in the League of Nations. For multilateralism to mean anything in the 21st century, India must recommit itself to revitalizing our international institutions and reforming them to make them relevant again in our fast-changing world. And I look forward to discussing how we might do that in the course of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhagavan. Very, very interesting perspectives that you've given us, and we'll come back to them in our interactive session. It's my pleasure to request Dr. Archna Negi to kindly give her remarks. Dr. Negi, you have the floor.
Thank you. Priyanka, is it possible to just put some...
Yes, ma'am.
Just try and share screen.
Please go ahead, yeah.
Are the slides visible?
Yes.
Yes.
They are. Okay. Thank you very much. I will just... Well, to begin with, it's absolutely wonderful to be speaking in this panel, and thank you, Ambassador Asoke Mukerji, for the initial words. Thank you also to the previous speakers for really, setting the tone for the discussions that will follow. My mandate, as it were, was to focus on issues of conservation in the environment and how they have developed within the United Nations. And since it's an anniversary year, anniversary years are usually looking back and looking forward, as Ambassador Asoke Mukerji also did say in the beginning. So I thought I would start first by just taking you very, very briefly through some of the milestones within the UN with a focus on issues of environment and conservation, in order to then see where we are and what are some of the issues that are of concern in general in the context of environment, but also from the perspective of India in particular. Interestingly, Professor Bhagavan was talking about the League of Nations. So let me start by taking you back there. And the photographs are simply, graphics to keep you awake. There isn't information so much as to just give you a sense of the history and the evolution of the issue of environment within the United Nations. So even prior to the United Nations, looking back at the League, and not very many people talk about this, the issue of environment and conservation had, entered the portals of the League of the Nations as well, although it did not yield very many outcomes, as it were. So the key issue that you find when you look at the League of Nations in the context of conservation was the issue of oil pollution in the seas, and specifically within the context of birds, protection of birds and the impact that the oil pollution was having. There were some very interesting developments that took place within the League of Nations in this context, and even though there was no legally binding sort of convention that came out of it, etc., the stage was set in many ways, because for the first time you were talking about a diplomacy where countries could engage even when they were not directly impacted. So there was a public forum offered to address issues of public good. A lot of countries said we will be part of this negotiation or part of this diplomacy simply because of international solidarity. So that was something totally new. Second sort of outcome of this time was also that it gave space for environmental activists, the environmental citizens, institutions, to reach out to each other at a global level and come together on issues relating to the environment. So in that context, again, this was a very, very interesting sort of development that you see there even before the UN. The UN Charter, so I'm calling the slides, taking it along as the life of the UN, and this is when the UN is born. And the photograph that you can see on this slide in the top corner is the Indian delegation mentioned before. You see Ramaswamy Mudaliar there signing the UN Charter. And the UN Charter per se has no mention of environment. So there is no recognition really in direct terms of concerns of the environment. So on a soft copy of the Charter, therefore, if you do a Control F on the word environment, you will not really find it. So, which is basically to say that during the 1940s, there isn't, as much focus on this particular issue. Of course, on issues of development, we all know that India had a role to play also in the whole idea of upgrading the ECOSOC to the position of, or to the status of a principal organ, which originally was not part of the blueprints which were being discussed at the United Nations. So environment really comes in much later as an issue in itself in 1972, and the Stockholm Conference is something I just wanted to flag. This is the first time that we are looking at, and this is UN at 27. So this is really the youthful sort of time of the United Nations. And of course, the one thing that one remembers from this conference is the presence of the then Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, who's also then talking about, or who flags the issue at the Stockholm Conference, saying that, even though we are supposed to be one family, this is a very, very disintegrated world. And going back to, what was said earlier about not just multilateral fora, but also multipolarity, so the distinctions there. So the Stockholm Conference really is one of the milestones that, or the first sort of, coming of age of the environmental issue within the United Nations. And it leads to, of course, this whole prolific phase of various conventions, etc., being adopted, and India too playing a very, very active role in the context of formulations of these conventions. So there is a wide variety of issue areas that are covered in this, 20-year period between Stockholm and Rio, where you're looking at issue areas of endangered species, of migratory species, of hazardous wastes, of heritage, natural heritage, etc., in which there is a very, very large Indian engagement as well. If you look at the history of India's participation in these multilateral environmental agreements, you find a very high level of ratification, and also active participation in all of these multilateral environmental agreements. After which, the second, big milestone that we look at is, of course, the Rio Earth Summit, 1992, coming of age, UN at 47, and really changing the whole way of looking at the environment. So the issue areas of focus that you see in the previous years, which focus specifically on, what are called the green issues, conservation, etc., wildlife, now move to aspects which touch more and more on development. So in this phase, we are talking about, ozone and climate, etc. And this is one blurry photograph. Ambassador Puri, you must be here somewhere in this room since you were present at Rio. So perhaps you can share with us later your experiences of that time, of actually being there. But also the etching out of the North-South divide, which you find in the context of issues of climate change, of forests, etc., which continue to. The outcomes of this particular summit at the UN, the most well-known ones, other than the declaration itself, are, of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UN Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change, which then in later years becomes more central to the politics that we see. The UN Millennium Summit, another milestone in 2000, which brings on board the Millennium Development Goals, one of which is related to environmental sustainability. So you have a separate sort of Millennium Development Goal adopted, which looks at environmental sustainability. but which is very different from the way the SDGs work, because when you look at the SDGs, you have the environmental concern infusing many of those, 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the MDGs run from, UN at 55 till the year 2015. Now, let me just stop here to make a very brief mention of, one issue area which a lot of people have an interest in, which is climate change. And this is typically what a climate change negotiation could look like. These are, of course, images of climate change negotiations in that huge, long period of deadlock when, the big transition was sought to be made. And very, very thorny issues were being negotiated at this particular time. And so this is before the Paris Agreement, where you had repeatedly several climate meetings which were deadlocked. And in this context, the role that India played is also something that requires, perhaps in this small time, it may not, but we could come back to it in the Q&A. But this is the phase where India is also at times viewed as being obstructionist because of its very, very strong stance on its development concerns. And also it speaks for the other developing countries in a way. So that big carve out that takes place between the so-called Annex 1 countries who have legally binding emission reduction commitments and the non-Annex 1 countries, and the whole question of whether India and China belong there, is something which sort of permeated this particular phase. And 2015, the Paris Agreement, which again we could come back and discuss, is the more happier phase of the climate negotiations, as you can see. You can also see extreme happiness here, of course, but this is basically a scene from Paris and from subsequently from Katowice. And the pictures at the bottom I always like to see because they also show you a sort of human, face of the whole climate change thing. You see, I'm sure you can recognize, this is Angela Merkel, in 1997. So this is the time when she's environment minister, and when she is, this is the Berlin Mandate in 1997, and this is subsequently the G20 meeting after the Paris Agreement. So it's a very long journey that the climate negotiations have actually taken. And following which you have, of course, the coming into existence of the 2030 agenda, which is adopted in 2015 to kind of replace and take the MDGs forward. And in the Sustainable Development Goals, as I said earlier, the environmental issue is actually infused in several. So, for example, you have SDG 14, the life below water, you have life on land, etc., etc. And the one SDG that I'd like to draw your attention to, because this is the one where a lot of our solutions may lie, is the 12th one, which is SDG 12, which basically looks at responsible consumption and production. And this is one of the issues which we really need to return to if we are looking at solutions for the environment. This is broadly the framework of environmental concerns over the 70 years. There are many currently ongoing negotiations. There are negotiations on biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, for instance. There is a push to move towards something more binding on marine plastic pollution. Again, issues which require a lot of thought. This is the second last slide, which basically looks at a whole lot of science which has come in the last year. So this is UN at 74, 2019. And what is amazing about this is that these are a whole lot of UN agencies which are telling you that things are not on track as far as conservation is concerned, as far as climate is concerned, and also related areas like biodiversity conservation. There is this whole, debate on a new geological era, whether we have entered the Anthropocene. And all of this science is out there. And one of the things that the United Nations has done over these 75 years is really providing you the science. And from a legal perspective, this is very interesting because environmental law has had at its center something called the precautionary principle, which told you that lack of scientific evidence should not stand in the way of countries taking political action on conservation, environment, climate, etc. And this seems to be turned on its head when you see the amount of scientific evidence which actually is being given to you that things are not going well. And yet political action is not matching with that. So whether it is the emissions gap report, whether it is the biodiversity one, there is a big gap. Finally, coming to UN at 75. So this is the sort of look back. Now, of course, anything and everything that the UN is doing is also from within the framework of the current situation, which is the pandemic, which is the COVID-19 situation. And the one thing which environmentalists, have always or are worried about is the distance that is retained between issues that are viewed as environmental protection and those that are viewed as public health concerns. So if you notice the kind of changes that the global community has been able to bring about because of COVID-19, a lot of those are from the wish list of the climate activists, right? Travel less, less emissions, etc., etc. So all of the public health issues, however, do locate themselves within the larger concerns of the environment, and therefore understanding that and bringing that closer together is something that is something we need to get back to. As far as multilateralism is concerned, and coming back to the Indian initiatives, the role particularly that India has had in the context of conservation and the role that it could have, there are, from a perspective of IR, for example, a whole lot of questions remain open, and I'll just tick them off because these could be discussed in detail later. In the coming 25 years, let's say, within the human rights perspective, for example, is environment to be recognized as a human right? Is it to be recognized as a security concern? From a negotiation point of view, now that India is in the Security Council as a non-permanent member, the question could be asked whether it would continue to oppose the entry of issues like climate into the agenda of the Security Council, where you speak of issues relating to environmental security. There was this whole question about reformulating to the Trusteeship Council to give it a green mandate, whether that could be something that we could look into, etc. So there are several leads from here, if we look at the next 25 years, where India can play a role. And Ambassador Mukerji mentioned right at the beginning some of the initiatives, which are welcome initiatives that India takes in the context of conservation, and more specifically the International Solar Alliance, which has been, of course, an Indian lead, and also the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the CDRI, where India plays a key part, and we could discuss these more again if there is an interest in them. But as I see it, these are issues where India also should take a lead, because it can prove this whole point about it being a responsible nation. The whole argument that we had, I was looking at the chat box, and there was a lot of interest in permanent membership. That's one thing everyone asks, that when is India going to be a UN permanent member? But it reminds me of a question which somebody asked me, that what does India seek to do with its permanent membership once it becomes a permanent member? And therefore, this whole talk of redoing the charter, opening up Article 109, also must lead to the question of the kind of proactive roadmap that we have. And to my mind, environmental conservation and issues relating to climate, etc., are an entry point where India should continue to take, I feel, an initiative which it has already taken, and take leads in order to then locate itself, in the changing international diplomacy. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be happy to come back if there are specific questions relating to these issues. And
thank you.
And back.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Negi. That was a very illuminating presentation. I would now like to turn to Dr. Aniruddha Rajput. We've been all waiting to listen to you, Dr. Rajput. So you have the floor. Please go ahead. I think you're muted. If you
Thank
can
you,
unmute
Ambassador Mukerji. It's very kind of you. I must begin by saying how immensely delighted and honored I feel to be amongst this distinguished panel. And it's truly a good balance because we have two experienced practitioners of international relations, two ambassadors who have worked in the UN and seen how things go on the field. And we have two academics who can take a slightly distant view of things, how things have unfolded. I probably could claim myself to stand nowhere or somewhere in between, because I do dabble between the academics of international law and the practice of international law. I'll try to look at the question which has been allotted to me from that perspective. In the initial introductory remarks, Ambassador Mukerji spoke that I should be addressing what really is the role of Security Council in relation to counter-terrorism in a greater detail than what Ambassador Puri has touched upon in his brief introduction, which covered a lot of areas. And secondly, what happens when there are bilateral treaties in relation to terrorism or generally under international law, and what is the consequence of Article 102 of the UN Charter, that is, what is a registered treaty. Well, India recently argued in the Jadhav case that 102 is inconsequential because it doesn't matter whether a treaty is registered or not. A treaty is a treaty. So 102 is only an encouragement to states to register their treaties. This was especially after the suspicion which states had because of secret security treaties which led to the Second World War. So apart from that historical relevance, today 102 doesn't have a real legal impact as such on the treaty. A treaty is legal even if it is not registered with the United Nations. But nevertheless, before I come to that point, I want to have a very brief detour because I also want to address the central theme of the topic. And the central theme essentially from the perspective of counterterrorism and the Security Council. So what I would do in the brief time I have is begin firstly by making some general remarks, then move to the role of the Security Council in relation to counterterrorism. Then thirdly, speak about the Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism, the CCT, which India has proposed. And integrated in that last point would be where it stands and what might be its future prospects. To make some general points, and I would like to join all the distinguished panelists in what they spoke about internationalism. And I feel myself immensely privileged because I come from a city, Pune, which is around 35 kilometers from the residing place of Sant Gyaneshwar. After Sant Gyaneshwar wrote his extensive commentary on Bhagavad Gita, he was still unhappy. And then he wrote a poem, which is called the Pasaidan. And he starts by saying, Ata Vishwatmake Deve. What he means is the God of the entire universe. He is not referring to X deity, Y deity. And in his entire poem, he's referring to what we call internationalism today. So internationalism, by its very nature and feature, is ingrained in the DNA of Indians. It is just that we were waiting for the right opportunity, which we got. And even if we look historically, in Chanakya's Arthashastra, one of the 7 attributes of statehood is statehood. Today, under the Montevideo Convention, there are 4 attributes of statehood. But for Chanakya, there were 7 attributes of statehood. And one of them was international relations. So international diplomacy, although there was no multilateralism then as we understand it today, but there was certainly an instinct of multilateralism that we have. Now, having said that, we also need to realize the strength and the weaknesses of multilateralism. And why I say that is because the difference between celebrating an anniversary of an individual and anniversary of an institution is, for an individual, we normally speak about the good things that the individual has done. But when we speak about the institution, we would be doing a great disservice to ourselves if we just recount the successes and ignore some of the failings of the institution. And the central institution for the consideration and in relation to the subject matter on which it is expected to act or ought to have acted or has acted is the area of counterterrorism and the institution of Security Council. Of course, when the United Nations Charter was created, nobody thought of terrorism as we think of it today. Certainly terrorism wasn't thought of as we think of today 30 years back. So India was one of the early childs screaming, there is terrorism, terrorism, and the world turned a back towards it. And Security Council in particular did turn a back towards it for a long time. It is just because we are an influential player today, we are able to have some voice of what we are trying to say. But if we look at how Security Council has functioned on matters of counterterrorism, what comes to our mind is really about the manner in which the Security Council has responded. And I would broadly categorize the Security Council response in three groups. The first group is the sanctions regime. The second group is the response of the Security Council post 9/11. And the third is the several mechanisms which the Security Council has created through the Counterterrorism Committee and allied activities. Now let us look at all of three of them to understand how they have impacted or whether they have had any relationship with India and how they have functioned in the overall context of counterterrorism. The sanctions regime really began after Libya was supporting terrorists who committed actions against certain European powers, in particular the United Kingdom. It was the Lockerbie incident, which was the first triggering fact in 1992 for the Security Council to impose sanctions on Libya, which continued until 2001. Then there was Sudan, of course, for trying to attempt Hosni Mubarak as a sponsor of terrorism. But what we do see in these two regimes, or even there is an example of Taliban, but in the case of Taliban, the sanctions didn't have any effect at all. The regime continued thereafter to strike the 9/11 attacks. But in all these events, what is seen is whenever it hurt the P5, one of the P5, Security Council did spring into action instantaneously. India has been suffering terrorism it started just around the same time in the late 90s, in 1989, the late 80s. And since then, India has been suffering terrorism, and we see that the Security Council does not take any step, does not make any effort at all. The next big phase of efforts of the Security Council is in post 9/11. After the 9/11 attacks, we of course have the more concretization of the sanctions regime, which people often call the 1267 regime, which is basically the Security Council resolution based on which people are put into a list, they are blacklisted, their accounts are seized. India has managed to have little bit success after spending a lot of energy in getting Masood Azhar on it, and now there is an exception allowing him to get a pension for his sustenance, which shows that, and we all know who has been obstructing India in the Security Council. It's of course the vested P5 interests. So what the story emerges is being in the P5 or being a permanent member allows many people to obstruct and sideline the realities of terrorism which exist in the today's world. Secondly, it also allows P5 members to raise the concerns of terrorism, not just as a concern of one country, but concern of an international community. And India has consistently tried to project it as a concern of the international community. And therefore, probably this could be one direct answer as to why India should be made a permanent member of the Security Council. Not just for all historic reasons and how the Atlantic Charter and the nice chat between Roosevelt and Churchill aboard a nice ship deciding the future of the world through the Security Council does not fit in the modern world today. So that's where we stand with the record of the Security Council. Then the third limb of the activity of the Security Council, which one could say is more dense, more intense, more active, is the Counter-Terrorism Committee. And I think Ambassador Puri can speak more extensively about his experience on that. But what we do see in 2011, President Obama thought this doesn't really work much because the UN diplomacy to maneuver through. So he said, let's have a global counter-terrorism forum in 2011 to have more cooperation between states outside the framework of the Security Council. So we do see states who do have interest in countering terrorism wanting to take the issue of terrorism outside the zone of the Security Council. It does also represent the limitations of the Security Council to deal with such issues. What could be, does it mean that Security Council can be of no avail at all when it comes to issues of terrorism? That's not what I mean. Council cannot be one-stop arrangement, one-stop solution for all questions of terrorism. On matters where there is a threat of a terrorist attack, and we do have an example of what India did through its air strikes on Jaish-e-Mohammed bases in Pakistani territory. It did so under a very valid exercise of right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Now, here is something India could not have waited forever for the collective securities mechanism to chip in. So the collective securities mechanism, as contemplated under the Charter, particularly in Chapter 7, cannot be of any avail when it comes to counterterrorism, unless an attack has already happened, which we saw in the post-9/11 attack of Afghanistan, the resolutions 1373 of the Security Council. But we don't want to stop till such an event happens. But if such an event happens, then probably that's a chance you go to the Security Council and seek for its help. And it all depends on in which mood probably China is on that day about our requests. But apart from that, there are several certain subtler aspects where the Security Council can and ought to play a role. And that comes on targeted measures in trying to control, for example, the accounts of certain individuals who are involved in terrorist activities, terrorism financing, and all those kinds of activities. So there is a need of a further nuanced approach as to what the Security Council can do and what the Security Council ought to be called upon to do in relation to some of these concerns. Now, when we speak of these specific measures that the Security Council ought to be involved in, it is therefore very important as to what direction the Security Council takes. And with the amount of experience India has had in suffering terrorism, it is probably the best suitable candidate to advise the world what ought to be done. And when I say what ought to be done, there are several prongs of it. One prong is of course, intelligence sharing. Of course, Pakistan would not be keen to share the intelligence because they're themselves actively protecting terrorists and harboring terrorists. But there could be efforts, there could be pressures, there could be efforts towards extradition and prosecution which can happen through or with the use of the mechanism of the Security Council. So there could be, if not the macro level measures, but there could be some micro level measures and some very effective micro level measures where the Security Council can certainly function, and I think as a non-permanent member, India could probably try to target all of that. I'll now briefly turn to what's happening with the CCIT and what might happen to it in the future. Now, the Comprehensive Counter-Terrorism Convention, as we all know, is stuck on two issues. First is definition of terrorism, and second, what is going to be the relationship of the Comprehensive Counter-Terrorism Convention with other terrorism conventions, because we have around 17, 18 other conventions. Let me tackle the second one, which is a smaller and a more simpler issue. We have the Convention on prevention of hijacking, prevention of explosions, prevention of nuclear weapons from falling, and weapons of mass destruction from falling into the hands of terrorists. So we have a framework of around 8 or 10 conventions. Some of them, for example, the Terrorism Financing Convention, is almost the entire international community behind it. They of course have provisions on extradition, but they deal with specific aspects. They deal with precise aspects maybe in the context of on the sea, on the air, but they don't deal with general aspects of terrorism. And that was precisely the reason why India introduced this text. But let us understand, when India introduced this text, India was still a country which was bubbling, and the world thought that India might have potential. This is 20 years back. Today, the situation has drastically changed. India is not a country which might have a potential. It is a country which is going to lead the world. And when it is a country which is going to lead the world, does it want to be the one which is going with folded hands and asking the international community to protect it through an international convention? Of course it should, because there should be international rule of law, no doubt about it. But is it going to really serve the international rule of law? The first question, therefore, to ask is, what is it that CCIT is going to achieve, if at all? The first, I think, when we ask that question, and there are several answers which emerge. Firstly, are we even going to succeed with our definition of terrorism? Most of the prior conventions because they didn't have to define terrorism, because they simply said hijacking of an aircraft is illegal, which was much simpler and straightforward. But on a general convention of this kind, it is important to define what is terrorism. The definition of terrorism, which this draft text adopts, it picks up from the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings Convention. And the interesting part is this convention is not just limited to protection of innocent individuals, that is civilians, but it also covers government establishment. None of the convention, except for those who have to, for example, an aircraft is a private establishment or could be a government establishment according to one interpretation. But introduction of government establishment is an introduction which follows the definition from the Prevention of Terrorist Bombings Convention. And that is one of the contentious issues. Interestingly, the Organization of Islamic Countries, who supported that convention, do not support India's draft. And what they want to spin in, and it's a spin because it's going to have serious consequences, is to say that those who are struggling for protection for achieving self-determination, or who are fighting against foreign domination or occupation, should not be treated as terrorists. Now, will India succeed in not having these two clauses and moving forward? That's for the future to hold. But would India want to proceed with these two clauses? If we look at the Terrorists Bombing Convention, there is a reservation made by Pakistan. The reservation says those indulging into self-determination are not included in the definition of terrorism. So it knows who it's supporting and what it wants to do. But tomorrow, and I think India should definitely and legitimately can do that under international law, the territories which have been currently occupied by Pakistan, which are called by Pak-occupied Jammu and Kashmir by India, have been illegally occupied by Pakistan, and Pakistan is in illegal occupation of those territories in violation of customary international law, in particular the Hague regulations, which decide or mandate what an occupying power ought to do. India may want to and may have to, in the future, might use any and every possible mean, including supporting those who reside in those territories, because they are an integral part of the Indian territory according to the UN Charter. Pakistan took those territories in blatant violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which says that a state should not use military force against another state and not appropriate the territory of that state. Although Pakistan initially began by saying that, well, it was not our army, it was a Kabylis, but very soon it came out and expressly said, of course, because India presented the evidence, Pakistan acknowledged that yes, it was our armed forces. If you use armed forces to occupy somebody else's territory, you cannot appropriate. It has to be given back. What happens to the resolutions of the Security Council? All of them are non-binding under Chapter 6, and there has been a treaty thereafter. So there is no question of those territories having been taken over by Pakistan forever at all. There might be these issues, and then the question arises, would India want itself to be bound by such a convention in the future? What value add does it bring, except for one sensational feeling that we have a convention in our name, or probably trying to expand the scope? Of course, there are areas of which are novel in this draft text of not to grant asylum or preventive measures which didn't exist in the prior conventions. But what is the cost to give, unless international community is ready to accept the definition that India is proposing? So we have to look at these issues in this context. And therefore, when we come back to what happens if there is a Security Council resolution, it is only when the resolution is under Chapter 7 that it is binding. Otherwise, it is simply recommendatory in nature. And states, it's more in the nature of an advice to states. And let me give you a much extreme example. Even a Chapter 7 resolution, the whole sanctions regime, was challenged before the European Court of Justice in the Al-Jeddah case, where there was an issue about this individual's accounts being taken over, being suspended, frozen for allegation of terrorism financing. The United Kingdom House of Lords said, yes, it is perfectly valid. It is what the Security Council has done and we are bound under Article 103 of the UN Charter. But when the matter went to the European Court of Justice, the principles of due process haven't been followed. Our principles or our European community values are more important than the charter value of United Nations under Article 103. Therefore, we are not going to abide ourselves by the charter of by the resolution of the United Nations Council. And mind you well, this is a Chapter 7 resolution, not a Chapter 6 resolution. India is in a much better situation because all the Kashmir issues are under Chapter 6 and not under Chapter 7. That's a completely different thing. Now, having been so much critical about the Security Council and the global frame, does it mean that international law doesn't fit? Does it mean UN doesn't fit into the modern context? Let me step back now and look at the bigger picture. When I look at the bigger picture, of course, multilateral diplomacy is important and has its values. But there are areas where it is effective. There are areas where it is ineffective. There are areas which states ought to give to the international community. There are areas which are best reserved for states to tackle the way that they intend to and wish to. Of course, by following the norms of international law. Creation of institutions by itself is not a solution. So, of course, environmental law, climate change, there have to be multilateral negotiations, and India has to push strongly when it comes to those issues. But when it comes to matters of terrorism, for those terrorists who are present in India, India can very well take action against them under domestic law. In fact, if the definition which is being pushed by the Organization of Islamic States is accepted, the consequence would be that additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention would be pushed in, of which India is not a party. And by converting terrorists into some kind of armed personnel, India would have to give them all kinds of deference and treatment which is to be given to armed personnel. And terrorists certainly don't fit into that framework. So there is that aspect which one has to be always careful about. I do see I've already spoken too long, probably gone beyond my time. But the last point I think which I should make is, of course, it is a time to celebrate. It is a time also to ponder. It is also time not just to ponder what UN has done. It is a time to ponder where India stands. And there is a sea change. There is a drastic change which has happened. I feel quite honored and delighted to be in that age frame where when I was growing up, people always made fun of us as Indians, to now where we see as Indians are looked upon with a lot of respect and reverence. When we speak of multilateral diplomacy, when we speak of India, we speak of us. People respect us as a country. China may be a huge lever. China might have a lot of money. It might be able to throw a lot of influence. And the reason why Ambassador Puri said in a direct election we could win is because it is us as a people what we bring to the table. And of course, the high table is not very far, although we are already there, but very soon we ought to be everywhere, and in particular on the high table of the Security Council as a permanent member of the Security Council. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajput. I'm informed by our hosts, the Indian Council for World Affairs, that they have some flexibility in giving us a little more time. I'm glad for that. And I think before I ask Priyanka to tell us about some of the important topics that have been raised by the chat from the audience, it would be remiss of me if I don't touch on three issues which flow out of the presentations made by the distinguished panelists. I think first, and I really want to emphasize this, that when we look at the 75 years of United Nations, 100 years of the centenary, we must always also remember and give due acknowledgement to the contribution made by the Indian armed forces to the victories of the First and Second World Wars, which also played a very big role in our getting invited to those conferences and meetings which resulted in the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of San Francisco. Because and you see that in the military history that is being published today, especially in the Western democracies, there is a grudging, I would say, but there is an acknowledgement that without the Indian soldiers, this victory of the Allies would not have taken place. The second point is something that struck me when listening to Dr. Rajput, and that is, and I'd like the distinguished panel to consider it in their response, is when looking at the relevance of the United Nations Security Council And Dr. Rajput mentioned about going outside the UN Security Council. He mentioned something which the President Obama started called the Global Counterterrorism Forum. And of course, he referred also to the other bodies which are outside the United Nations. My point here is that in order to make the Security Council relevant and effective, are we approaching a time when the Security Council will enter into beyond the UN relationship? For example, they have already adopted the norms of the Financial Action Task Force in their resolutions. And in a sense, they are making these Financial Action Task Force norms mandatory internationally to be applied on the ground. Similarly, the norms that have been put forward by other bodies like the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which is also reflected in a Security Council resolution, or looking to the future, what Ambassador Manjeev Puri mentioned about India becoming part of the new institutions that are being created and are likely to be created, a G7 plus or a revitalized G20. Are we seeing, therefore, a gradual move out of this catalyst of COVID-19 towards a Security Council which is different from the 1945 creation in the UN Charter? That is a point that I'd like you to look at. And the third point that I think, while I'll ask Ambassador Manjeev Puri to respond to all these questions that have come on the chat, is on the permanent membership issue. Now, one of our colleagues has asked in the chat, what does this mean for the position taken by the Uniting for Consensus group? So I know Ambassador Manjeev Puri will happily take on the relevance of the Uniting for Consensus group's position on Security Council reform and permanent seats. But the larger issue is that do we need to look at the role of the veto? Are we seeing a move now towards either limiting the use of the veto, which has been proposed by even a permanent member like France, or replacement of the veto by majority voting? So these are broad issues, but having raised them, I would like to turn the floor to Ambassador Manjeev Puri to respond to this question which has come from the chat, which is, what are the prospects for UN Security Council reform as you see it in the next 3 years, for example? Manjeev, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, sir. And I want to tell you, I was very happy listening to all my co-panelists and hearing a lot of what they said. And to realize again what I said, that the United Nations was created following the understanding of why the League of Nations didn't go forward, i.e. as not pure multilateralism, one country, one vote, but multilateralism with a degree of multipolarity. And perhaps that is the reason for its success at the moment. And for us to try and get into that side of it, we are naturally part of the multilateralism, is, I think, very important. Now, it's very difficult for me 2 or 3 years. I have no idea. But the important thing from my perspective is that the efforts to push this should remain strong and relentless, no matter that you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, because this is one of those end game issues which is not going to happen easily, because it is an issue which gives you, let me say, in terms of your wanting to be a member of the Committee of Nations, it does give you some degree of hegemonistic power. It gives you some degree of being able to influence the outcomes. Now, that is why it's important. And the last several years, we seem to have allowed it to go a little way, because otherwise I can't see why the Secretary General's office-led draft that we have this time for the 75th anniversary merely says things like breathe new life, instead of what was said even 15 years back, support early reform of the United Nations Security Council. Now, who are the people going to take the lead? Is it going to be Uniting for Consensus? Of course not. Are they not the large number of people? The answer certainly must be yes. But you have to leverage this issue of polarity and who you are. And as Aniruddha just mentioned here, we're a changed country. You aren't there as part of the G20 or as an extended G7 just because you exist there. It is because you bring something to the table. And when people start seeing that, both those who are inside and those who are not inside, that is where things happen and you can contribute. There should be no doubt that it's not a question of creating new institutions. But in all these institutions, it's on the decision making and the influencing side. They are the ones who matter, and that's how things are going to unfold. Of course, there are exogenous matters, what technology does or whatever else happens in the world. We really have to accept it. So my point remains very limited, and so the Security Council gives us a unique kind of visibility. Of course, we need to look at every issue and bat on it in the manner that is correct and also serves our interests, but at the same time ensure that we don't look at it just as another 2-year term and it's over, then we'll sit again, but look at it to focus such that we're there again. We are part of those who will take decisions for making the United Nations a more relevant body for global governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Manjeev. I think that was a very, very well put point of view. And I'm glad you made it, because many of us always say that it is not that we are a non-permanent member, but that we are an elected member. And that is a critical difference. Professor Bhagavan, from your presentation, there was one issue which, if you allow me to raise with you, and that is, how do you see the withdrawal of the current United States administration from multilateral institutions impacting on this overall holistic approach of belonging to a committee of nations? Do you see the current trend of the Trump administration withdrawing from various bodies as something that will continue, or can it be reversed? You are sitting in New York, and probably you're better placed than I am to probably respond to this question. Yes, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. First, what amazing presentation. So thank you, everyone. I've learned so much from all of you. I think we're at a very precarious point. I think much will depend on what happens in the next couple of months. I think the damage that has been done over the last several years in terms of what the Trump administration has been doing in terms of both withdrawing from international commitments, norms, and institutions, but also in terms of resetting things to unilaterally move in whichever direction it sees fit. And parenthetically, that appears to be with the support or in conjunction with whatever Russia wants it to do. This is sort of an unclear set of circumstances as to why. But I think all of this can, relatively speaking, be reversed if a new administration comes in. I think that's true in terms of the domestic erosion that has occurred, and it is also true in terms of the international erosion that has occurred. But if the president is reelected in November, I think the consequences will be much more long-lasting, and the kind of destabilization that can occur at the international level will be very significant.
Thank you. Dr. Negi, there's a question addressed to you in the chat, which is on how the United Nations is responding to the issue of disasters connected with environment and climate change. Would you like to speak a little on this, based on how you see it? Is the United Nations being effective in its response?
Yes, so this is on disasters. You know, the work of the United Nations is located within the humanitarian assistance institution. So you have the Office of the Coordination Humanitarian Assistance. from where or located from where the United Nations functions. It dispatches what are called the UN Disaster Assessment and Coordination Teams, and I think we've seen these in India as well. This is the older sort of mechanism. It has existed since the 1970s. And there is also, of course, outside of the UN, the work happening on humanitarian assistance. So there is coordination on that as well, which happens from within the ICRC on aspects related to that. And the Indian engagement also, I would like to again mention the recent MOST initiative, which you had mentioned, Ambassador, at the beginning. The National Disaster Management Authority has been more active as far as the Indian response is concerned, and now the whole initiative of the CDRI, the Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, is a sort of cooperative, research coordination and cooperative initiative that India has. And as I said, even in my presentation, these are issues. So whether it is Solar Alliance moving forward on technologies, etc., whether it is on disaster resilience, or even on potential coordination on water, this is the sort of old argument that in international relations, the functionalists and neo-functionalists made long back, that focus on issues where coordination is possible, and then habits of cooperation will create spillover effects that will lead to, better outputs in political issues. So for me, the entry point is very good when you focus on issues relating to disasters, relating to renewable energy. Somebody asked about renewable energy. Because I'm not as hopeful as, Dr. Rajput had an optimistic take on the high table being very close by. I agree with Ambassador Puri that the effort must continue, but we also have to take account, many other, for example, the G20 did not really replace the G7. Traditional structures do, continue to exist. And in fact, it was long back under the Heiligendamm process that the G8 had reached out to what they call the Outreach 5 countries. But when it comes to, permanent institutions like the United Nations Security Council, there seems to be more resistance to change. I mean, we are talking of, 100 years of this institutional sort of architecture remaining without changing at all, and it's locked and double locked under the double veto systems, etc. So I would have a more cautious take on the permanent membership issue, but I would say that the inroads are being made in the right direction by kind of saying that, look, we are a responsible nation. I mean, if you have a look at Prime Minister's speech also at the ECOSOC weeks. A lot of it was devoted to on how India took a lead on the pandemic, etc. This whole thing about responsibility and responsibility.
Thank you, Dr. Negi. Dr. Rajput, let me come to you. In the chat questions that have come, there's a very intriguing question on communication technologies. Now, I'm going to ask you a question which is not from the prepared text. But how do you see the United Nations, especially in your work in the International Law Commission, which is to study and recommend to the General Assembly the creation of new legal architecture? How do you see this issue of communication technologies or digital technologies? Are they live issues in the International Law Commission? Are people trying to suggest that the United Nations should move like it did in the 1980s when it adopted the Maritime Convention on Law of the Sea? Is it now moving towards, suggesting that a discussion should start on a convention on cyberspace and digital technologies? Can you give us some feeling of this issue?
Thank you for a very interesting question. After I got elected on the commission, the secretary of the commission was introducing me to somebody from the ICRC. And he said he's one of the newly elected members and he brings down the average age of the commission by half. So you can imagine that how adept we would be for using technology. or probably why I've made it there so fast is because I'm myself not adept with using technology. So at the International Law Commission, it is highly doubtful that the Commission would want to take relation to cyber security and issues, which was proposed by one of the former members of the Commission, who's now a judge at ITLOS, Judge Kichisari. But after he left the Commission, nobody had interest in picking it up and working on it. I have my sincere doubts if the Commission would be the right place, and especially in light of the expertise that is required to address these issues. Now, having said that, if we look at what's happening in the UN, and it's essentially happening through UNCTAD, and it's happening on the private international law side, and it's all about the digital e-commerce. There's some effort at the WTO, but as we all know, WTO is at a stalemate, not just thanks to President Trump, but also thanks to President Obama, who started blocking the appointment of fresh appellate body members. So he has inherited and probably aggravated the problem. There's some discussions happening there about what do we do, how do we regulate digital economy, but that's purely a matter of private international law about looking at the economic benefits of the process. But when we look at cybersecurity, we are looking at it from the security angle, and some very underlying questions of if there is a cyber attack, does that qualify as an armed attack under the UN Charter? Because it is possible it is competent or capable of causing certain damage. If such kind of cases do arise in the future, I think there is certainly some amount of scholarly writings, some effort to interpret, because as you know, treaty making is not a simple process, and certainly not a multilateral treaty. In fact, I was going to quickly respond to Dr. Negi and say that we can certainly agree on one point, that in multilateral diplomacy, very soon means at least 25 years. So, but there's no harm in being hopeful that someday sun is going to rise. And one of my friends used to say very funnily, cows are going to come back home. I never understood the meaning of that, but he meant they'll ultimately come back home someday. But I think what's important is spirit. But that's one of the problems. So, and now there are all kinds of interests which are coalescing around. So it's also about where different countries stand about how much they want to protect cybersecurity. There was some news about Australia being attacked from bases in China. Terrorists are doing it all the time. So, but I doubt if anybody has the enthusiasm to make a treaty, because there's a very interesting phrase which some scholar used, treaty fatigue. There's a fatigue of a multilateral treaty. It's really tiring. And I think Dr. Negi summed it up excellently when she showed the pictures of the co-op. It's basically, people are tired, and how much to negotiate and what to negotiate. And in that whole, and we're just not in that right set of circumstances where we can expect some effective treaty to come out, not at least for the next 2 years until this pandemic issue subsides, the economies come back to some sort of normalcy, and then we start thinking about which problems we need to resolve. So at the moment, nothing is happening. But just to quickly supplement to the question that you asked to Dr. Negi, the reason why I'm responding is because the Commission recently finished, again, now recently is 6 years back. That should be instantly, I think, in terms of multilateral diplomacy. The Commission completed what is called the protection of persons in events of armed disaster, in event of environmental disaster or natural disaster. Sorry, I correct myself. And in that project, one of the most contentious areas, what can a third state provide help to the state which is under a natural disaster, to it, because it's ultimately about protecting persons. The Commission didn't go that far. It says it is based on consent and discussion, but you have to give a fair chance. There's a whole body of human rights jurisprudence that has been brought into. The Commission completed the second reading, recommended it to the General Assembly and said, please do something on it. But it has been almost 20 years now that the Sixth Committee hasn't negotiated anything what the Commission has sent it, especially the draft articles. For the draft articles on state responsibility were sent in 2002. They're still pending. There's no movement in the General Assembly Sixth Committee. Nobody seems to be quite interested in that. So it's really doubtful. So there's one mechanism which the Commission has been doing is it comes out with what is called draft principles or draft guidelines. And these drafts and draft principles get automatically circulated in jurisprudence. Like, for example, the articles on state responsibility are extensively used every day by international courts and tribunals to hold states responsible. It's also a wake-up call for states who think we can just sit over it and nothing is going to happen. They need to realize there's so many international courts and tribunals. There's a Tribunal of Law of the Sea, forget the ICJ, there's so many investment tribunals, human rights bodies. There's so many avenues to litigate. They end up using the work of the commission. So if the states don't respond to it at the Sixth Committee, and definitely in relation to articles on state responsibility and other products, they might have a lot more to pay. But I think at this juncture, this wisdom is something of a luxury.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajput. Priyanka, are there any other generic big questions that are in the chat which I have left out? Or can we recommend that ICWA will collect the questions which have not been answered and provide us the emails of the people who asked these questions so that some response can go from the distinguished panelists to whom they have asked these questions? Can I make an assurance of this kind? Do you agree with that?
Certainly, sir. Certainly.
Yes, thank you. That is very.
All the questions have been adequately addressed by our panelists. So,
yeah. So in the last, and it remains for me, because I have lived all my life in the offline world, but therefore this habit is still ingrained in me. But may I request each of our distinguished panelists in 1 minute to give a message on what they, related to the theme of our discussion today. What is the one important message that you would like to leave with the audience which has been listening to us so patiently? Ambassador Puri, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for leading this very illuminating discussion. I have just one thing to say. India has changed, and India is changing to become an even better and bigger force for good in the world. We must ensure that we do what else is required to secure for ourselves a place around the global high table. This doesn't mean only the Security Council and lots of other places, because I think we are somebody who can contribute. In fact, we have contributed and we have much to contribute to the world. That's all that I would say. And I want to thank you all very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Bhagavan, your big takeaway today?
Well, I think the central question we have to ask ourselves is what security means in the 21st century. I think a lot of what we covered in this panel takes security at a very baseline level, that is survival, the expectation of life. But there's also quality of life issues, and there's also equity issues within the existence of life. And so I think it's really important for us to consider whether or not human rights are in fact a security issue. And on that point, because I'm a historian and that was the focus of my presentation, I just come back to this one last observation, which is that when Hansa Mehta our very first foray, when the Human Rights Commission was opened at the United Nations, her very first move was to put forward a proposal where human rights would be the purview of the Security Council. This didn't really go anywhere, but you asked me at the outset, what do I make of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights? Well, the UN High Commissioner is merely an advocate. I think the real key is how we move the idea of human rights from sort of bare minimum consensus to something which is objectively towards rethinking the very idea of security in the 21st century. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Dr. Negi, your takeaway?
Please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Please.
Sorry, even I'm new to the unmute world. I'm sorry, I'll just repeat myself. With your permission, sir, 2 points instead of one as takeaways. And one is, of course, generally to do with the whole issue of the environment and the learnings from the pandemic. That is, we need to reassert. This is not something new. This is something which was written way back in 1962 when Rachel Carson wrote her book, that the environment and public health are very, very closely linked. Because the pandemic has certainly showed us that we are capable of taking a whole lot of action which we were unwilling to take when it was presented as something, in the context of climate change. So there is a major rethink required there. And just a second small point is from the context of Indian diplomacy on climate change. I think we need to increase the focus of India as a player. Because, we usually say that this is what India can do. Can we argue or can we negotiate to not have binding emission targets or have voluntary sort of commitments, etc. But it's also time to step back and see India as an impacted stakeholder. The impact of climate change, and I personally am not a climate skeptic. I do see it coming. At the moment, we are all, busy with COVID, but just behind COVID is the other big thing. And I think we need to be more diplomatically active also on aspects of adaptation, especially given the whole, problem of inequality, etc., and the more vulnerable sections of society within the country. So our diplomacy also needs to move in that direction is something that I really want to.
Thank you. And you have the last word, Dr. Rajput.
You're very kind. India is moving from a dominant observer to an active player. And when this change happens, there are bound to be some good things and some bad things. There is bound to be some support and a lot of opposition. And what is going to be important is how we tackle and handle that opposition and move forward. Because moving forward and taking its rightful place is not just a choice or aspiration of India. It is the world's desire. And when I say the world, I mean the global third world. We are not fully aware, except probably Ambassador Mukerji and Ambassador Puri, because they have been in the UN premises. They have felt the amount of goodwill, affection that people have for us just as Indians. And they're willing to do it just for India. So I think it is the time now that the world expects us to take the lead. And we would be failing in our duties if we don't. And there is a lot of work to do. But before I end, I must say I didn't begin by thanking ICWA. I thought it would look a bit odd because I'm a part of the governing council. But the ICWA is not just the governing council or its face. It is actually humans. And it is truly Ambassador Raghavan and Dr. Priyanka who have steered, organized it very well. So maybe from somebody who is inside the ICWA, but not so much inside, I can take this opportunity to truly congratulate them for putting together such excellent panel with excellent balance, very interesting thoughts. And I'm sure all my panelists would agree with me on that. And I really thank everybody because I also had so much to learn and very interesting interactions with all of you, for which I'm again grateful to ICWA. Thank you.
Thank you. So Priyanka, I now turn the floor back to you. I've completed my job as a moderator.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. So on behalf of Indian Council of World Affairs, it is my pleasure to propose a formal vote of thanks. Please join me in thanking the distinguished panelists for entrusting us with their time and sharing valuable insights on the theme. Today's discussion have benefited immensely from their rich expertise and scholarship. I would express my sincere thanks to Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, DG ICWA, for his keen interest on the theme, guidance and the support that we received during the webinar. I am also very thankful to DDG ICWA, Mr. Shomen Bakchi, and JSICWA, Ms. Nutan Kapoor Mahavar, for the constant support towards the preparations for the webinar. A special thanks to the IT and the seminar team for ensuring a smooth running of the webinar. I'm also very thankful to the Director Research, Dr. Nivedita Ray, and Research Fellows for their valuable inputs and support. Last but not the least, I would like to thank our esteemed audience for joining us this afternoon from various parts of the country, from different time zones, and for making this webinar a success.